Welcome to the joint session of the Banking and Financial Services and Startups and Venture Capital Commissions. Today we're going to speak about sustainable finance. You have seen in the press some recent news that call for some sustainable actions. We have seen a lot of different movements that call for sustainable investments. We also see a lot of financial institutions, banks, that allege to work hard to improve sustainability portfolios. So we're going to see a bit where is the stand of the market. It's difficult to define what is sustainable. So intergovernmental bodies, NGOs, have stepped to try to develop sustainable finance standards. We have the UN that has several initiatives. Last month, a number of important banks have signed and adhered to these standards. We are going to speak about all this and see if the state should intervene or we should stay on private initiatives. We're going to go to view two main sectors. So the plan is the following. We will have first an external speaker that will be introduced shortly by Paolo. Then we will have a panel on sustainable asset management with a large panel and a discussion around asset management and sustainable finance. After the coffee break, we will speak of impact bonds, and we will finish, because we are lawyers, with liability. So that's our discussion of today, and I leave the floor to Paolo.
Good afternoon. We are honored to have today with us Ms. Julie Becker. Ms. Becker is member of the Executive Committee of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, with responsibility for the management of the listing activities, promotion and development of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange matters for international debt, equities, derivatives and investment funds. Ms. Becker initiated and implemented in Luxembourg the Green Exchange, a new platform dedicated exclusively to green instruments. This initiative, a first in global capital markets, has been rewarded with numerous awards and recognitions worldwide. She also had been appointed in 2016 to the EU high-level expert group on sustainable finance. Before joining the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, Ms. Becker had different positions in the legal and compliance departments in the banking sector in Luxembourg and abroad. Thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here today and to talk about sustainable finance, which is one of the topics which is very close to my heart as a founder of the Luxembourg Green Exchange. Sustainable finance is not a niche. It's a foundation of capital markets of tomorrow. Sustainable finance is the single biggest business opportunity since the Industrial Revolution. And green bonds are one of the most important tools to implement the Paris Agreement. But what's a green bond? Have you ever advised some issues to issue a green bond? Could you please just show your hands, just for me to know if you were aware or not of this issue? Okay, thank you. So green bonds are any type of bond. But what is quite specific to those bonds is that the proceeds will be exclusively dedicated to finance or refinance green projects. And they are aligned with the 4 core components of the GBP. The GBP are the Green Bond Principles issued by ICMA, the International Capital Markets Association. They are voluntary process guidelines that recommend transparency and disclosures and promote integrity in the development of the green bond market. They are intended to be used by a very broad range of actors in the markets because they provide issuers with guidance on the key components involved in launching a credible green bond. They aid investors by making available all the information they need to understand what a green bond is and what kind of green projects they will invest. And they also assist underwriters by moving the market towards expected disclosures that will facilitate transactions. So the Green Bond Principle recommend a clear process and disclosures for issuers, which investors, banks, underwriters, private placement agents, and others may use to understand the characteristics of any given green bond. The market is only 12 years old. Why? Because the first climate awareness bond has been issued here in Luxembourg by the European Investment Bank, closely followed by the World Bank, who issued the first green bond, or so-called green bonds, and which claims to be the first one, but they're both listed on the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. So what are concretely the 4 components, the 4 pillars of the GBP? First, as I just mentioned, classification of the bond, the use of proceeds. This is a cornerstone of a green bond, the utilization of the proceeds of the bonds for green projects, which should be adequately described in the legal documentation for the security. But it is only voluntary practice. So as you know, in any kind of prospectus, you do not have to describe precisely the green purpose of the use of proceeds, and we still see some green bonds with the use of proceeds being general corporate purpose. But what is needed now is to have an additional documentation describing the use of proceeds of this bond, which is not a legal documentation, but an additional documentation to the existing one. So all designated green projects should provide very clear environmental benefits, which will be assessed and where feasible, quantified by the issuer. The GBP, the Green Bond Principles, explicitly recognize several broad categories of eligibility of green projects, which are, for instance, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, natural resource conservation, biodiversity conservation, and pollution prevention and control. The second pillar is about the process of project evaluation and selection. And what is requested here is that the issuer of a green bond should clearly communicate to investors the environmental sustainability objectives. So the process by which the issuer determines how the projects fit within the eligible green project categories should be identified. And it should also explain what are the related eligibility criteria, including, if applicable, exclusion criteria. And as the GBP encourages a high level of transparency and they recommend that an issuer should also have recourse to a third party and to an external review, and that this process of project evaluation and selection should be reviewed by an external reviewer. The third pillar is the management of proceeds. What does it mean? That an issuer should be able to isolate the funds he has raised through the bonds to allocate them to a specific project. So how does it work in practice? The first sovereign, the Republic of Poland, when they issued their first sovereign bond, they decided to create a dedicated account in their central bank. But what the GBP recommend is to be able to credit the use of proceeds to a sub-account or to move them to a sub-portfolio. But the main important thing is to be able to track them and to identify clearly what the issuer did with the proceeds that have been raised. The fourth pillar, and the most important one for me, is the commitment to reporting. What does it mean? That the investors, for the first time in the history of finance, will be able to check how the issuer delivers on its commitments. So the issuers ex ante, before the launch of the green bond, commit to invest in a specific green project that could have an impact, or that will have an impact. And he will have to report on this 1 year after the launch and on a regular basis, on a yearly basis at best. So issuers should make and keep readily available up-to-date information on the use of proceeds to be renewed annually until full allocation. That's the fourth pillar of the GBP. And the external review, which is not a fifth pillar, but something which applies to all of those four pillars, which are the green bond framework. So we encourage issuers to have an external review, which is normally issued pre-issuance, so before the launch of the green bond, to certify that the green bond framework, which describes the use of proceeds, the process of project evaluation and selection, and the management of proceeds, is compliant with best market practices. Those external reviews can take different forms. We can see some second opinion. We can see certification, verification, ratings, and green bond scoring. In addition to the green bond principles, the ICMA also issued the social bond principles and the sustainability bond guidelines. And all of this is dependent on the use of proceeds. Either it's 100% green, then you will talk about the green bonds. If there's core social benefits of a green bond, then it's a blend of green and social finance, and we will talk about sustainability bonds. So far, green bond principles are only voluntary guidelines. But as you may know, the European Commission has set up a high-level expert group in December 2016, which issued a first report in January 2018 with 10 key recommendations that have been closely followed by the European Commission when they issued their action plan 8 weeks afterwards in March 2018. And in those recommendations and the legislative package they suggested even 2 months afterwards, in May 2018, one of them was to establish an EU green bond standard. So endorsing best market practices existing in the market, endorsed by main market players, but to be sure that we all speak the same language, which is translated in the Commission words by this EU taxonomy you may have heard about. And the taxonomy has nothing to see with tax, but it's only a classification of economic activities that are considered as green, which also embeds a transition process. So what is green today will not be necessarily green tomorrow. And in this classification, in this taxonomy, everything is already foreseen. So what is new in this green bonds, EU green bond standard? So first of all, you need to understand that it's only an option. It's not at all mandatory. Any kind of issuers can still issue a green bond, which is not EU green bond standard compliant. That's very important for the European Commission. I'm convinced that why they are pushing for standards and labels, so labels for funds, is because this will help us to maintain the integrity of the market, avoid greenwashing, and be able, for instance, for governments to issue incentives and link those incentives to those labels and standards to avoid greenwashing, for instance. So an EU green bond standard is also based on the 4 pillars of the GBP, as you can see it on the slides. But the criteria are a bit more stringent. So first of all, for the use of proceeds, what's a green project is now a project which is EU taxonomy aligned. So you need to be sure that the use of proceeds are aligned with the taxonomy that has been defined by the EU. Then for the green bond framework, which refers to the allocation, the reporting, impacts and verification, it's more about for the issuer to describe its overall sustainability strategy, to check whether this green project is going to finance is completely consistent and compliant with the overarching strategy of the issuer. So what is really new is that now, so as I just described, we needed one report, you remember, a commitment to a post-issuance report. Now what the EU will request is 2 reports, mandatory. One is the use of proceeds report, the same, the allocation report, but also an impact report, which is mainly provided now since 1 year and a half, 85 of issuers provide us with a post-issuance reports. It's not yet 100% of issuers, especially small corporates. For them, it's quite heavy to provide that kind of report, but they will be mandatory as long as the European Commission will endorse the proposal made by the technical expert group. So 2 mandatory reports, one pre-issuance, two mandatory reports post-issuance, allocation or use of proceeds reports, plus an impact assessment report. On top of this, the verification, the third-party review, the external review I was mentioning, will apply to 2 reports. So ex ante, the green bond framework should be verified by an external reviewer. And on top of this use of proceeds report or allocation report that was provided until now so far as self-declaratory by the issuer will have to be verified. So only the allocation report, not the impact report, which, however, becomes mandatory. So now when you issue a green bond, you have first to establish the green bond framework, which has to be verified. You have to be sure that you have a project selection which is very clear, management of proceeds, and you commit to issue post-issuance 2 reports, a use of proceeds report or allocation report, which has to be verified by an external reviewer, which is new, and an allocation report, which is mandatory, and this is new, but not to be verified by an external reviewer. And on top of all of this, those external reviewers, to maintain the integrity of the market, should be accredited. So today there's no verification or supervision of external reviewers like we can have for any kind of auditors, for instance. And that's why, because some external reviewers could pop up, like it happened in China. So to maintain the integrity of the market, the accreditation process is currently being defined by the technical expert group, which is actively advising the European Commission so far. What is quite clear is that ESMA should be the competent body to accredit or to supervise this accreditation process in 3 to 4 years. But in the meantime, we have to put in place a platform which should be representative of market players to be able to ensure this transition between what is existing today, so nothing, no accreditation, no supervision of external reviewers, and in the future, ESMA acting in this matter. So how does the green bond standard, the EU green bond standard I was just describing, fit in the new EU framework? So the EU action plan has been issued in March 2018 with 3 main objectives. First, it's about reorienting capital flows towards sustainable investment. The second pillar is about mainstreaming sustainability into risk management. And the third pillar is about fostering transparency and long-termism. And I guess that you will hear about sustainable finance all afternoon long, so it's maybe important to have those 3 main objectives very clear in mind. They have been declined in 10 actions. And you can see here in dark green, new legislation to come that has been released last May. So one of them is, of course, the establishment of the EU sustainable taxonomy, which is almost ready, at least for the green part, meaning climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. So everything which is linked to sustainable finance or social aspects is not yet ready. I'm not going to enter into many details about the taxonomy unless you are interested in this, but the European Commission has defined 6 environmental objectives. So to be compliant with the taxonomy, you need to comply with one of the 6 objectives, plus you need to I'm sorry, I'm missing my words, to be sure that you are not affecting one of the other, and you do have also to respect labor international conventions. So in dark green, you can find as well sustainability benchmarks, for which the report has been published already and approved by the European Parliament as well, and sustainability disclosure and accounting, which will change the world, especially of asset managers. In yellow, you can see also second level of EU regulation, so amendments to existing regulation, which are related to incorporate sustainability investment advices. It's about MiFID. I'm sure you have heard about bankers and financial advisors, which will have to request the sustainability preferences of their clients in the future. So everything was linked initially to know your customer, and so due diligence of your clients, and also the risk profile of your client. And now we are talking about sustainability preferences of your client. So a very big, lots of documentation to request from your clients to be sure to comply with all the regulations that will apply very soon. And still in yellow, also the clarification of institutional investors and asset management duties. And we are talking here about fiduciary duties, about exercising, of course, voting rights, and all of what you've already heard, I'm sure. And that's where also the creation of standards and labels appear in the action too, but which should not be mandatory, meaning in a legal framework to be defined. So far, the European Commission didn't decide to endorse those principles and the EU Green Bond Standard in a new directive or regulation or any kind of amendment. So still to be seen, but we were also expecting the new Commission to enter into action to see how the new president as well would like to act, and what kind of regulation will be released. Now, I'd like to come back to Luxembourg and what we did so far in this context. So in 2016, we launched the first and still unique. I mean, competition is arriving, and we are quite often copying now. We launched the first green platform, which was initially entirely dedicated to green bonds. Green bonds only, and thanks to our success, we extended the platform to social bonds and sustainability bonds, but also to other kind of financial instruments like funds. So we have 3 windows for SRI funds, ESG funds, social funds, and green funds. We also display indices, in particular Chinese indices. We are working very closely with China and with Chinese exchanges, and we display simultaneously some green bonds that are displayed on Shanghai or Shenzhen stock exchanges on our screens. Of course, they are not tradable in Luxembourg, but information is made available for international investor community to be aware of what's happening in China, and everything is, of course, available in English. Our objective was clearly to support the SDGs, 17 SDGs you didn't miss, of course, which are the main challenge of the future. And what we decided when we launched our platform was to align with internationally recognized standards, and mainly GBP. So what we made at that time was to transform those voluntary principles or guidelines into mandatory entry requirements on our platform. So those 4 pillars I was describing earlier are mandatory on our platform. So if an issuer wants to be displayed on our green platform, it needs to provide us with an external review of the green bond framework. It needs to classify the use of proceeds, and it needs also to commit to provide us with an external review. So we do apply voluntary practices and make them mandatory on our exchange, which does not mean that we already comply with the EU GBS to come. And we recognize not only the GBP from ICMA, but also ASEAN standards, the PBOC guidelines from the Public Bank of China, So any kind of standards which are internationally recognized, even if not aligned with the GBP, as long as the issuer commit to transparency and explain to what kind of standards is going to commit, and those standards are clear and internationally recognized, then it can be displayed on our exchange. And it is very clear for investors that all documentation will be made available for free to investors to be able to take informed investment decision and to compare one product to another. So how to join this platform? As I was mentioning in my introduction, a green bond is a bond. So first, the security needs to be listed on the exchange. And we mention here in this slide registration because we have a new option in Luxembourg which is available for our issuers. You can be listed on our regulated market, which is the Bourse de Luxembourg, or you can be listed on the Euro MTF market, which is the exchange-regulated market supervised by the exchange itself, and submitted to our rules and regulation and not EU regulation. But you can also be only registered to a securities official list, and this is a specificity from Luxembourg, without being admitted to trading. So it's only a question of being registered on this official list without admission to trading. And the interest is for some issuers, like high-yield bond issuers, for instance, to avoid falling under the scope of some regulations that apply to securities that are admitted to trading, like MiFID II, market abuse regulation, that kind of regulation. Then you need to classify your security. Is it green? Is it social? Is it sustainable? And to commit to transparency and disclosure, so to the 4 pillars we mentioned, the external review and the post-issuance report. And what we're going to do is to monitor that all the documentation is up to date and made available for investors on our platform. So we created like a centralized data hub of all green documentation in this platform where you can compare one issue to another because the entry requirements are exactly the same for all of them. Where we are today, it has been quite a success. We have a 50% market share of all listed green, social, and sustainability bonds worldwide, which means $200 billion US and more than 540 securities listed on our exchange, coming from 40 issuers in the world and listed in almost 20 currencies. So it's the place to be. And some issuers, the who's who of the capital markets, chose the Luxembourg Green Exchange, in particular the Green Platform, as their reference platform for all the thematic bonds. It was the case in particular of the World Bank, which decided last June, at the occasion of the Sustainable Finance Forum organized here in Luxembourg, to display 180 sustainable development bonds on our platform. So what's the main benefit of joining LGX? I guess you understood. For issuers, it's clearly a question of promotion and enhancing the visibility of the issuer, promoting its efforts to provide investors with additional documentation. And for investors, of course, it's about accessing free and green documentation in a centralized data hub, and to be able to compare one product to another. And because it's very important for issuers to have one place, one venue where they can list all the thematic bonds, we also have some issues like IFC who decided to double list some green securities, or for IFC it's more social securities that were listed already in London or in Milan, to double list them on this green exchange to be sure that for their environmentally friendly investors, they have only one venue where they can find all the instruments. So it was mentioned in introduction. Of course, our achievements have been recognized, and we are very proud of this, especially of environmental finance recognition 3 years in a row as the best exchange in green finance. So to conclude, sustainability is about survival. And as the Vice President of the European Commission said at the occasion of the launch of the EU Action Plan, without money you can dream, but with money you can act. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions?
what are the maturities involved in green bonds, if there are comparables to other type of instruments that are listed, and how does this compare to in terms of investors' attraction to the instrument?
Yes. So the maturity is difficult to say, but I would tend to say that 7 years would be an average of maturity of that kind of bonds. Of course, some projects can be fully completed. For instance, solar power plant or wind turbine power plants as well, in 3 to 5 years. And the maturity of the bond can be longer because the green bond can also refinance. Some green projects are not only financed as long as the issuer has explained it from the start in the use of proceeds, that it's about financing and potentially refinancing the green bonds. And normally it should even give an indication of the percentage of financing and refinancing green projects in the use of proceeds. Second part of your question was about...
In terms of comparables with...
traditional finance.
The traditional finance in terms of performance in the stock exchange.
Good question. I like this question about performance because we definitely need to get rid of this performance myth. It's very clear that ESG or sustainable investing is exactly the same than traditional or plain vanilla investing. Especially because at the end, the credit rating is exactly the same. But I think that we also have now some survey, in particular from Morgan Stanley, that clearly shows how ESG finance performs much better than traditional finance, specifically in terms of or during volatile period, where ESG is, of course, much more stable and long-term. You're welcome.
I would assume that they would be subject to usual rules governing prospectus and...
Absolutely.
Is the exchange itself in charge of approving the prospectus as well, or is it a responsibility that still belongs to the, I would say, the normal regulator?
So we are quite a normal regulator for our own market. So when you want to list a security, you choose either an EU-regulated market, which is, in our case, is the Bourse de Luxembourg, which is supervised by the CSSF, and that's the competent body to approve a prospectus for a security which will be listed on the EU-regulated market, subject to EU regulations. But you can also choose the Euro MTF, which is the biggest MTF in Europe. It has been created in 2005 at the occasion of MiFID I. 10 years of existence, 10,000 issuers listed on this market, and this is supervised by the exchange itself. So the process is a bit more flexible. It's a fast-track process. We commit to list in 3 days. 99% of our securities are listed in 2 days, especially when we already know the issuer. And it's subject to our own rules and regulations, and not to the EU regulation.
Est-ce que vous avez contribué à créer ou collaborer avec d'autres bourses vertes à travers le monde?
Yes, absolutely. We have been seen as a leader and a pioneer in this area, and that's why we have been very well recognized, especially in Asia, in China. So we signed MOU with Shanghai Stock Exchange, with Shenzhen Stock Exchange, so with the CIBM markets representative, which is a Chinese interbank bond market. So you may know that in China, you do not list all securities. It depends on the type of the issuers. So for instance, when a bank, for financial institutions, they do not list on an exchange, only corporates list on exchanges, but banks, for instance, they list on the CIBM market, which is supervised by PBOC, while exchanges are supervised by CSRC, so it's different regulators. And so we also signed MOU with the CIBM market, and at this occasion we listed in Luxembourg first green bond that has been issued by ADBC, one of the first policy banks in China, and also domestic Chinese green bonds for a total amount of 500 billion euro last year, so which is really huge. We also have signed a memorandum of understanding with Nigeria Exchange to list in particular or double list their sovereign bonds. We signed this summer a memorandum of understanding with Santiago Exchange, which is very active in Chile in sustainable finance as well. And the objective is always to promote sustainable and green capital markets in those emerging countries and to help them being better understood or more visible, not only at a domestic level, but also at an international level. So we are clearly aiming at creating a network of green bond listing venues. We are also part of the UN SSE, the United Nations Sustainability Stock Exchanges, where we do contribute to that kind of cooperation. What do you mean by the falls and bans? Yeah, of course. But do you mean in sustainable finance in particular? Sustainable finance, yeah. Green bonds. I would not say so, not so far, and even not at all more than for plain vanilla bonds, for instance. What I did not mention so far is that when we launched this platform, we decided to not judge the issuer. So oil and gas company, we are convinced that transition will take time. So we have to encourage all issuers to onboard on sustainable finance and to switch progressively their business model. So we have oil and gas companies that could issue some green bonds, financing some green projects on our exchange. But what we see more recently is that more and more investors want also to know the profile of the green bond issuer. So the ESG rating and the CSR profile of the issuer is becoming more and more important. But what may also be very interesting to know is that the contrary also applies, and we do not talk about this. But some green bond issuer, because there's of course a lack of supply, lots of demand of green bonds, and some dark green issuers, like for instance KfW in Germany, are very interesting to be able to choose their investors. And they also want to access the profile or CSR or ESG profile of their investors, because all those green bonds are really highly oversubscribed.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. Now we will move to our sustainable asset management. So let me present to you Nabil Markaboulmassi, who has come from Geneva for us. He is the CEO of Inox Capital. Inox Capital is an independent alternative asset manager based in Geneva, who's generating, through the management of funds, sustainable growth by structuring capital solutions, mainly active in financing in Africa and in Eastern Europe.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be as lively as possible so that not to bore you. So I'll give you some basics about who we are. That should take 2 minutes, no more. And then what we strive to do and some examples of actually what we do. Yeah, here we go. So we like to say that for us, sustainable investment, what we do is exactly a portion called alternative credit. So it's non-listed debt and direct private debts. So again, we are an asset manager of collective investment scheme, and we are regulated prudentially by FINMA, the Swiss regulator. And as you will be able to see, we've been doing that since 2005. So we have 14 years of activities in the field, and we're not new convict. So our mission is to provide substantial and resilient wealth creation for stakeholders by impact investing in sustainable commodities. And here you would notice the dichotomy, sustainable and commodities, because normally these two tend to be opposed as per general wisdom, mostly acting in agriculture and food, renewable energies and recycled metals value chain. And our vision is, of course, we don't have the steam, neither the strengths of an exchange, but to be the market leader by adapting our capital is most efficiently channeled to the real economy players in these value chain, using innovation and anchoring ourselves on our values. And our values are about rigor, excellence, teamwork, and integrity. So I won't bore you with that, but that starts back to 2004. And today we manage a little north of 500 million in the strategy. And to date, we have invested in excess of $4.4 billion. So it's small, it's nothing in the investment world, but still, it's a sizable portion of what's out there. So let us talk about how we do it. So our concept is that collective investment schemes are aiming to provide capitals for growth to private corporates that create tangible value within sustainable agricultural, recycled metals, or renewable energies value chains, and whose business models are not speculative in nature, and that we can understand, and whose financing needs we seek to meet. And we do that by structuring and granting bespoke, efficient, and secure capital solutions, which ensure, and that's the purpose, obviously, environmental, social, and governance compliance, so talking about the ESG, tick the box, and also promotes defined positive impact that our predecessor mentioned, which are Sustainable Development Goals, which are UN-derived, through their corporate footprint, so through their everyday activities, which are able to, A, comply with the not to do, and also generate to-dos in a nutshell. So when we look at that, again, that means that our strategy, or the way we look at things in sustainable finance, at least our reading of it, is that one should do no harm, and in terms of legal aspect of it, or framework, or normalization of it, one should have a selection process that seeks to get rid of the ESG risk, so to speak. And for that, we use the IFC performance standards. So these ones are addressing the ENS, but they're not directly addressing the governance. So one talks about governance standards. Actually, there are plenty and there are none. So today, there is no normalization, so to speak, of what is meant by governance. You only have certain guidelines and certain things to adopt, which are mostly derived from laws, and local laws tend to prime to international concept in that aspect. So as councils, that governance compliance thing is something that is precise and not precise at the same time. And on the do-good part, it was funny. When we started the journey in 2005, ENS was barely on the map. SRI, nobody was talking about it. And impact was not even existing. So we moved from a completely non-normalized situation, not standardized situations, with somewhere moving to a strong effort towards standardization. And in impact, for instance, you got the UN SDGs, obviously, and of late, you even have the IFC operating guidelines and principles, or operating principles and guidelines for impact measurements, which just came out in Q1 2019, and we are signatories of these operating principles. So our ideas, as the graph shows, is to do good in terms of poverty alleviation, food security, environmental quality, women empowerment, and do no harm in sectors of environmental and social risk mitigation and corporate governance. And that's a twofold thing that we try to marry in emerging markets by directly providing capital to these SMEs, SME, all the way to the majors, so to speak. So we talked a bit just before about the Sustainable Development Goals. So obviously you've got 17 of these, but it will be illusionary to think that through each and every investment one can achieve defined metrics or defined positive externalities in all of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So one has to focus on what he believes he can do and can be a promoter of change into doing. So ourselves, we decided to focus on 4 themes which lays around poverty alleviation, food security, corporate governance, and environmental protection. And actually, this slide is outdated because since 2019, we've added women empowerment and mobility in the workplace. So that means that we're addressing another SDG, which is SDG number 5, which is not listed here. And on the not to do's or ENS compliance side of the business, in law, what does that relate to? That means that We are not considering countries or companies which are under sanctions. And which sanction regimes are we adopting? We are adopting the Swiss sanction regime, of course, because we are FINMA regulated and we are Geneva based, but we also adopt the UN, the EU, and the OFAC sanction list. And obviously, in terms of ENS, what we seek to do is to provide, not to provide capital to products such as alcohol, tobacco, obviously guns, and gambling industries. Also, in terms of most efficient use of resources, we tend to be anti-GMO, so we scrapped GMO of the list as well, and we don't entertain anything that's animal tested, and that's for the reputational risk part of the investment, and obviously we would not be engaging with anything that would breach ILO standards. So basically, our workers' rights are defended in the specific countries and globally in terms of forced labor, child labor, global rights, and that would endanger the activity or also the environment and animals. So obviously, as you will see in some example, that means that if you want to guarantee all these do not do's and do's, then it's a pretty granular view that one needs to have to the investment. It's a different approach. It's for us, green bonds are absolutely necessary and valid way to access capital for sustainable finance, but green bonds may not address grassroots issues of SMEs and SMI in emerging markets, which do represent in emerging markets 60% of the GDP. So one needs to find ways to address them, and you need to go grassroots. There's no other way. Yeah, and we do profit. So we are a private DFI. We got money from institutional investors and family offices and DFIs and governments. They get credit for investing? They get zero credit. They actually, we're only starting to report about that for 3 years. Initially, when we started in 2005, we had in our prospectus ethical bias notion, which is do not do and do, again, what we call do not have any negative externalities and at least have one positive externalities aside of governance. But had we spoken the way we speak today, nobody would have given us a dime. At the time, we were talking about low volatility, volatility absorption, non-correlation, resilience, yield, cash plus product, ABL, asset-based lending. Otherwise, nobody would have given us a dime. But thanks for asking the question. So, going back to the how do we manage this dichotomy, which is, I believe, why we're here. Well, let's try to address the do-good principle. So, again, if one looks at you want to make sure that the investment will be generating, the sustainable finance investment will be generating the goods with the prospective investees, then you first going to address what that corporate's footprint in that given value chain and segment is able to generate in terms of poverty alleviation, food security again, women empowerment, and environmental quality, by the nature itself, the inherent nature of the products, services, and activities of the corporate. So definitely, well, we're not going to be funding smelters, mining, and extractive industries, because by default, you dig a hole. So when you dig a hole, you can do it better than others, but you're still digging a hole. So there are other ways to do it, and that maybe is better done through more long-term capital provided by green bonds, for instance, where you can change the infrastructure, you can change the way you manage these much bigger projects that have to do with this kind of value chains. And then you need to see how the corporates offers solutions to help and achieve sustainable commodity value chains on the long run. So how are they able to change the way they buy, the way they sell, the way they add value, and what actually is their impact as a proponent of change in the way things are done in the value chain. So it's a four-stage process that we go about, and we go first run to an impact quick scan, whereby we want to ensure that the alignment is there with our impact principles. Then there will be an analysis that would be done before the investment to quantify and actually see how the performance can happen. And then you're going to negotiate given targets of betterment with the corporates. So there is an initial compliance phase, then there is a betterment phase, and finally, how do we monitor through time the exercise and how the sustainable investment has been able to not only continuously ensure ESG compliance, that's the covenant part of the credit, but how is the plus being generated in terms of impact, which also can form part of a covenant if you do a typical funding transaction. So we try to be really 50,000 feet. We'll go into the details thereafter if you want, but the idea was to give you some examples and some concept ideas. So for us, ESG and impact management in practice is foremost, needs to be a DNA and not an overlay, and we will show you examples of that. It has to happen as early as possible in the investment mechanism, and it needs also to be part of the investment decision metrics, and also it serves as a continued risk management appraisal technique. So I'm gonna get rid of this and kickstart to give you some quick example over 5 minutes max of how this is done. But if one looks at a complex investment decision-making process, one may see, I don't know if you see there, I won't bother you with all these squares, but you would see that you have to embed, for instance, ESG pre-classification even before considering a due diligence. So that means that as a firm, as a corporate, you have to engage them as early as possible in the investment sourcing process to make sure that you have at minima certain liabilities, reputational liabilities or reputational risks that you do not want to onboard. So typically in legal terms, what would this result into is that you're gonna try to very early on identify, typically very similarly to what somebody is doing in a banking relation, who are the UBOs, what's the corporate, do you have negative press, you use obviously instruments such as World Check, Equity, and global ICG, ICIG, WikiLeaks, and so forth, to see if you can have an immediate risk mapping of that potential counterparty or corporate to whom you're seeking to engage to be a vector of the change. Because already if at the beginning there is an issue there, there's no point to further contemplate doing anything further. So that's very early on in this process. That's at this level. And then obviously there are a number of things that you have to dig to, and pretty much like any banking institutions, oops, that's not working, so that's not good for me. What can I show you else? You then derives pre-screening elements. So basically, if one looks at in terms of impact through simple questionnaires, so we have extracted the impact ESG initial governance questionnaires in our sourcing process, and out of basically a maximum of 10 questions, you're already able to know if the counterparty is going to fly or not fly in terms of being a proponent of recipient of sustainable finance. So it's also not rocket science, and it's also scalable. That's what we wanted to say. It's not a niche business, because we've been able to deploy $4.4 billion like that. So it's not something that is very niche-y. But that's one example that I wanted to say. And obviously, you have to do ratings. So there is always an element of quantitative appraisal. So based on the IFC performance standards, you basically have a total of 200 metrics that you can pinpoint for each corporate, and from which you can derive a summary of ratings or performance on each performance standard that is defined by the IFC. So it can be extremely precise in terms of ENS compliance. And then you definitely then have also the capacity to onward follow through the time of the investment through, again, very specific queries that you see that you can address in terms of sustainable development, poverty alleviation, food security, and environmental respect. So you have defined ways of having access to the data and trailing the data through time. What is interesting to notice, and we may not have the time to decide that, but the latest IFC operating principles for impact management, if you're a signatories, and there are 77 signatories of that, and we're one of them, it just started in Q1 2019, it imposes on you, first, to be accepted, and two, to be audited. So you need to be maintained as a signatory, you need to provide your system, your metrics, and they need to be tested by independent third parties, such as an auditor, for instance. Obviously, it's not Ernst & Young, KPMG, Deloitte, but probably they will end up doing it as well, because I know that, for instance, KPMG and Deloitte are offering ENS or ESG auditing, but they will also start in impact. And if you get a grade, so you get an audited, not the financials, but audited on your processes, and now you implement them. So definitely you could go towards standardization, control of the standardization, and onward betterment. So these are just examples that I wanted to show to you. Thank you.
So thank you, Nabil. I suggest that we take the questions at the same time as we move on the panel, so we can have already our panelists on. So I'll present you our panelists for. They're coming. So we have 5 panelists. We have Thomas, who's coming, Thomas Gossens from Blankischwald in Geneva also. We have Travis Gehring from the US, from Version Gehring. Donald, I'm going to pronounce it correctly, Venkatapan from Luxembourg. And Barbara from Italy, and Yonka from the Banking Regulation and Supervision Agency in Turkey. So first, let's start for the questions, maybe for Nabil, if people have questions in the room.
So the average ticket size has been to date $5.7 million. It has ranged from a minimum of $1 million to a maximum of $125 million. So it's quite wide span, because we address primarily SMEs and SMIs, which has compounded 60% of our investments to date. But we also do mid-market and major companies if they are capable to change their practices. So hence the much bigger tickets in that sense.
What is the typical cost of the debtor to do this? With all of the auditing and all of the processes, there must be an enormous cost to the borrower.
We are primarily addressing emerging markets corporates, which by definition we go into markets where access to capital is deficient, either in number or either in format, and we seek to go in markets where they are the best supplied with what we call, in terms of economics, work and land, so other factors of production. So in that sense, the inherent cost of capital is high in these markets, but our spectrum has been on the low side about 6.9% and on the high side 14%. So it still remains fairly competitive compared to a traditional access or traditional financial intermediation. And with one advantage is that sustainable finance has always had in mind this idea of bespokeness. What I mean by that is, first you try to understand the needs, the financial needs of the corporates and its business, to define a structuring, and there I talk with councils in terms of what kind of security package you want, what kind of covenants you want, and so forth, what kind of cover ratios. So it's much more bespoke, and therefore it's much more efficient most of the time, because what is the point to give someone credit at 0% if the conditions or the CPs or the covenants are impossible for him to meet? He will never be able to use it.
Do you know, in addition to those rates, what the typical borrower pays in terms of legal fees, costs to...
We are talking all in. Okay. We're already talking all in.
Okay.
Nabil, Approximately how long does it take from start to finish for an issuer?
Yeah, I mean, not talking about, we like to call them investees or beneficiaries, as they are not issuing a note, so to speak, or a bond, but it's a direct lenders, financiers, or financiers-borrower relationship. But to go through the due diligence process and all the shebang, it takes at least 3 months. But if it takes more than 5 months, then it will never fly, so it's a drop. So it's also quite efficient because it's highly standardized and procedurized through the 14 years of experience. So it's quite efficient.
I was wondering if you, in the contracts with the SMEs, considering it's a lending, if you have any kind of behavioral milestones for them to commit regarding the objectives of the investment, and if you do so, what are the remedies in case of failure?
So yes, typically that has evolved through time. So initially it was called an ESG SRI undertaking letter, because at the time the norms didn't exist. And it was a list of, again, not do's and to-do's. And typically it would embed any new refinement. So typically when the UK Bribery Act came out, you had to revamp it because you had to apply definitely some issues that had to do with the UK Bribery Act, which was a fairly good standards to avoid bribery situation or positions in emerging markets. So we did that through a side, which side was a CP to the main financing facility agreement, so to speak. And then through time, it became an integral part of the CPs and the covenants itself. So basically, they have to comply from the beginning. And if they don't comply, it becomes like a regular, simple covenant breach, in which ways the remedy mechanism are the same as any other covenants. And most of the time, it's 60 days remedy period. And if they can't remedy, then it's a divestment.
Maybe on that question as well, I guess there would be reporting obligations or duties to monitor the compliance with these criteria, no?
Yes, absolutely, because the truth of the matter is obviously it's very easy during a due diligence process to make sure that they comply, but then you've got to ensure that they continuously comply. So obviously we have defined bespoke KPIs, which they have to provide us, and we have to test these KPIs. So that means that at least quarterly, then you need to be able to test these KPIs. So either you test it, obviously we are an organization, so we are a corporate, so we do have this team to do that, or you commission third parties to test for you on the ground these KPIs and make sure that there is compliance. And sorry, final part of your questions. Then ourselves have to be audited on that basis. And the way we thought about it is that by being a signatories of the IFC operating principles and guidelines of impact measurements, then automatically it compels us and forces us to also be audited on our implementation and downstream work, so to speak.
Okay, thank you, Nabil. We will have some questions for our panel regarding regulations or non-regulations regarding sustainable asset management. I'll start with the, I think, easiest. Travis, what's the statute in the States?
So that was a softball to me. There are no special regulations in the United States that apply specifically to sustainable finance. It is treated like any other financing product. The investment instruments are regulated by the exact same regulatory authorities, and the rules and obligations apply to the issuers of the instruments and the intermediaries to the same extent as if the security was issued by any other type of issuer.
And Donald, is it different in Luxembourg?
Yeah, for the Luxembourg jurisdiction, it's there is no legal obligation to invest in sustainable products or services. But I would say that, however, considering the obligation to disclose non-financial obligation, especially there is a law that have been issued in 2016 that implements a EU directive for 2014, so the EU Directive 2014-95, which basically requires large companies to disclose management reports including non-financial information relating to environmental, social, or individual issues. So basically, you have a clear incentive for these large companies to follow ESG guidelines and to basically take into account this in sustainable investment in the way they invest, in the way they manage their companies. So there is no legal obligation to invest, but clearly there is an incentive for these companies to invest in sustainable investments.
And Jonka, I understand that in Turkey, banks have some obligations when they do some lending.
Good afternoon, colleague. I would like to emphasize that environmental and risk assessment process works for investors' activities and projects based on impact analysis under the banking sector sustainable principles issued by Banking Association of Turkey. Although those principles is voluntary, but nevertheless, all banks and investors shall obey them under the BAT's decision. At that point, I would like to explain briefly how the process works for you as follows. Banks should categorize all such projects according to their risk levels between low risk and high risk. Concerning the above-mentioned issues, if the investment project's potential environmental and social risks and effects are either non-existent or else so minimal that they are manageable without the need for special measures under the low-risk category. But if the investment project's potential environmental and social effects are severe, an environmental and social management plan and environmental social monitoring report are required. In addition, the recommended current situation analysis, gap analysis, comprehensive environmental and social risk assessment, cumulative impact assessment, ecological impact report, etc. under the high risk category. In addition, the risk assessment process for environmental and social issue commitments in lending terms that banks should include the action and monitoring plan formulated for the particular environmental and social category identified based on analysis of risks as a separate clauses in the lending agreements in Turkey. Moreover, considering environmental monitoring and reporting issues, banks should monitor the compliance with the action plans under the category of the environmental and social risk as a result of their environmental and social analysis. At that point, if it needs, banks may require investors to take additional measures going beyond the issues referred in those reports upon findings on on-site visitings. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonka. In Switzerland, could you tell us a little bit what's going on, Thomas?
So with pleasure. So in Switzerland, basically, there's no specific piece of legislation which provides for any obligation to invest in sustainable companies or products, but there is a but. Things are a little bit bubbling around, and there are, I would say, improvements, and some initiatives may be worth mentioning. First, at federal level, it's not maybe what you would expect from being usually called as a sustainable, I would say, sustainable promotion, but or an obvious sustainable promotion. But it is worth mentioning that there are two pieces of legislation. One is governing the law on executive pays, which was called in Switzerland under the initiant who brought it, who's called Mr. Minder, so it's called the Minder Initiative, that brought some sort of better governance on the pays of executives. So that's one thing. The other restriction which is imposed to the Swiss citizens stems from the law governing war material, which obviously is also a kind of restriction which may be worth mentioning here. But apart from that, at federal level, there's so far nothing specific which obliges you to invest in sustainable companies. There is, though, an announcement made by the Federal Council in 2018, which is willing to introduce, and we may discuss it further on during this panel discussion, but which is willing to introduce the concept of sustainability in the fiduciary duties of asset managers. So that's one thing, and that has been made as an announcement by the Federal Council in 2018. At cantonal level, as you may know, in Switzerland we have the Confederation, which is the federal state, and we have then the several cantons. And the several cantons may adopt or issue laws or piece of legislation which may have their own sustainable, I would say, investment promotions tools. And that's the case, for instance, in Geneva. In Geneva, for instance, you would see in the Geneva Constitution that the right of any human body to live in a sound environment is part of the Constitution. So that has been the legal basis for the Geneva state to adopt a law governing the state pension funds of the canton of Geneva, for which there is a specific provision which imposes to the pension funds of the Geneva state to invest in sustainable investments. And that has led to two recent very interesting initiatives, one of which has been announced, I think, last week, which has been the development or the launching of two green bonds by the Geneva state. One was to promote, I think, the building of hospitals houses or for ancient people or old people, and the second one has been to promote a new rail connection in the Geneva area to reduce the pollution relating to the traffic in the Geneva canton. So that has led to two issuance of green bonds. I think they managed to issue approximately 600 million of Swiss francs in a very short period of time. And these are, I would say, worth mentioning initiatives at the cantons level. So that would be it for Switzerland.
Barbara, for Italy, are banks or asset managers have any incentive, obligation?
Okay, so in my legislation, my Italian legislation is very linked to European Union legislation. So I would like to say that I would like to remember that in March 2019, the European Union adopted an action plan on sustainable finance. So in this moment, to reply to your question, Olivier, the reply is that no, there is not legal obligation in this moment, but the European Union is clarifying institutional investor and asset manager fiduciary duties to ensure they take sustainability into account in their investment decision. Before my colleague says something about the problem of disclosure, because in this moment, institutional investment, asset manager, bank do not disclose to the client if and how they consider sustainability factor in their investment decision. A news of today, so our session, I think that is very important because today the European Council, in the field of the Capital Market Union, publish a press release, and in this press release you can read that the European Council today adopted two texts. One of these texts concerns the transparency obligation for the sustainable investment, but for the moment we have to wait for the final text. Another point that is important, and this with a particular focus on Italy, this year the Bank of Italy is the central bank of my country, and the Bank of Italy this year adopted a new investment strategy that integrates ESG factor into the management of its equity portfolio. And I think that is very relevant. The last point of my answer is the following. because in my opinion is a topic that is very relevant, and is that illicit financial flow are prohibited in sustainable finance, because illicit financial flow constitute a measure disabled to sustainable development, because illicit financial flow have a direct impact on a country's ability to raise, to retain and mobilize the armed source to finance sustainable development. And please remember that one of the commitments of the United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development is to reduce illicit financial flow, and so to reduce also corruption and anti-bribery in all the forms. Thank you.
Is there any question for the time being in the room? So I'll continue with my questions. So we see that there's no, if I understand correctly, all of you, no real legislation that is binding. It's more standards that has to be complied with. What are these best practice rules? Are there specific rules in your country, or is it only based on the international standards? Do you have an idea there, Donald?
Basically, in Luxembourg, I insisted on the fact that we had this presentation on Luxembourg Green Exchange, and it's clearly an incentive at state level to implement sustainable investment. So the Luxembourg Stock Exchange also issued a very interesting ECG reporting guide. So you may find it on their website, but it gives basically guidelines to asset managers, banks, companies, how to implement a sustainable investment procedure, or how to question their stakeholders, also investors, about sustainability, and also look for the way to implement this in sustainability policies. But that's one of the aspects. But from a Luxembourg point of view, we also wanted to implement labels to give a sort of a possibility to apply these labels and carry out these labels and be sure that you have a sustainability stamp on your company. So there is a non-profit association that has been, or company that has been created. It's public and private. It's called Lux Flag, and they provide labels on sustainability, and these labels can be sought. So there is of course, criteria and guidelines and requirements to obtain these labels, but that would be a way to qualify for this ECG investment. So that's one of the possibility we have. And last but not least, I would mention we also, from a pure Luxembourg guarantee point of view, the securities, we implemented a new pledge letter recently that applies to renewable energy. So basically, if you have renewable energy bonds that would meet some requirements, you may obtain the capacity to issue an additional pledge on these renewable energy bonds. And well, I will not go into too much details in that because the criteria are quite numerous. But it could be a useful tool as well to guarantee this type of investment. So that's what we implemented on a Luxembourg level.
Now I'll move a little bit further on when we have these products or these investment strategy that we have on sustainable finance. It's nice, it's green, but are there any regulations regarding the distribution of these products? And does the regulator verify that it's green as it should be? Maybe Thomas, you want to start?
I can gladly start. What is for sure is that in Switzerland there's no such monitoring at regulators or financial supervisors level. But what is for sure as well is that, as you may know, Switzerland being not part of the EU, in order to meet the equivalence test, it has to comply with whatever standards would be applicable in the asset management world in Europe. And as we may hear from the other speakers, there are currently changes to the EU regulation, which will integrate these ESG standards in their own fields of regulation. This will be true at products level in the, for instance, AIFM and UCITS directives, but that will also be true for MiFID. So without entering into detail, when Switzerland or when Swiss players will be willing to provide services within the EU, they will have to comply with these obligations, and obviously Swiss law will have to integrate these principles as well, so as to be capable of showing that it meets the equivalence test.
So Barbara, can you tell us what are these European rules?
Your reply is very interesting for me because you are from Switzerland and I am Italian, and before I say my legislation is very linked to European legislation. And before I said that in March 2019 the European Union adopted an action plan on sustainable finance. One of the points of this action plan concerns the distribution of financial products that are sustainable, because the European Union in this moment is requiring insurance investment firm to advise clients on the basis of their preference on sustainability. And the legal basis that you are mentioned are MiFID II, that is a directive, very important European Union, that concerns the financial market and the financial service, and IDD, that is a directive that in European Union concerns the distribution of the product in insurance field. And so this is very relevant because the product for the client has to be suitable. And so the rule in the European Union in this moment is incorporating sustainability in investment advice.
And we're always scared with the US, so US persons.
Yeah, for good reason. As some of you may have noticed, the Supreme Court of the United States just the other day decided not to hear an appeal of a very important case, which referred to as the traffic monsoon case, which basically set the standard that the SEC has worldwide jurisdiction on enforcement of all its rules and regulations. So for better or worse, for the time being, that continues to be the case of the law. And going to the point of sustainability and distribution in particular, in the case of public companies, there are what are known as industry guides that the SEC relies on, and the companies must make very detailed disclosures about what the status is for their compliance with each one of the criteria for their specific industry. And in particular for the extractive industries, mining, hydrocarbons, things of that nature. The SEC has become more and more attuned to the notion for disclosure, not only requiring information regarding reserves, which of course investors are interested in, but also requiring information for investors about what the ultimate cost for remediation of the environment is in respect of the particular extraction. So that's been, from a regulatory point of view, a development that is taking more and more notice. And then also on a related point, as some of you, maybe most of you well know, there are really two separate regimes for enforcement in the United States. There's the regulator regime itself. The SEC can take an initiative to require particular disclosures specific on a bespoke basis to a particular issuer if the SEC believes that the information is not comprehensive enough for the public to be well informed about what the extent of all of the risks are related to any particular investment. And that has taken the form of requiring more information about sustainability in general, and in particular about what the impact is on the environment, on the social considerations and governance of the company itself. So for lawyers, it's not always easy because a lot of these questions, and as the SEC calls them, comments, what they really are requirements that the issuer must comply with. Many of them are not codified, so we just have to come to an informed basis of how to guide the clients on these matters by reference to other comment letters which have been issued by the SEC. And then separate from that regime, then there's also the private regime, meaning that an investor, if he believes that information in any distribution prospectus contain material misstatements or material omissions of information that would have made a difference with respect to any investment decision, they can themselves privately bring an action against the company under the famous Rule 10b-5. So the issuers do have it in their interest to try to be as comprehensive as possible, both with respect to the SEC enunciated considerations for disclosure and then also making sure that they're being as comprehensive as they can with respect to all material information, including information that would be material from a sustainable point of view.
Jonke, I understand that banks have an incentive to invest in sustainable or to have sustainable assets for their capital adequacy.
Yes. Pleasure, Olivier. Within the framework of sustainable companies, banks must monitor sustainable risks, and this could have impact on capital adequacy requirements depending on the risk assessed. With regard to issues under Basel I, Basel II, and Basel III standards, some concerns proposed to which green credit was subject to less risk weighting for Pillar 1. Concerning the observation for non-performing loans of green credit rate was lower than the corporate credits. This provision was evaluated from EU Banking Commission. Moreover, following proposals towards systemic environmental risks explicitly be added among high important risks based on Pillar 2 and the thereby evaluation of systemic environmental risk exposure level of banks and reporting concerning matters of the risk governance based on Pillar 2 are discussed on the agenda. Upon the adopt those provisions, Turkey will apply them within the framework both Pillar 2 and Pillar 3 on the required time.
I'm going back to Nabil. We see that banks have to be sustainable, otherwise they have to have more capital. Do you see some impact of that on?
Yes, indeed. It's funny how liquidity tends to flow where it's easier. It's like water. So it happens that, as Miss Yücel said, banks are very intelligent and they are coming out with their new credit funding capacities and starting to underwrite green credit for firms specifically willing to adopt specific sustainable practices in the way they conduct their business, hoping that that will ease their Basel IV ratio requirements in that aspect and still allow them to maintain mostly commodity finance or commodity structured trade finance exposures. So yes, it's starting to change the landscape because commodity finance or trade finance was heavily penalized under Basel IV in terms of ratio requirements unless you were dealing with the rated counterparties. So therefore, they're seeing an opportunity there to flow capital. I think the regulator intended such things to happen, and it's proving to be a very efficient mechanism.
So I think we have to do a break now. So we'll come back after the break in about... Yep. Sorry, go.
Portugal, listed companies and mainly banks, they have governance and sustainability reports linked to governance. How does that work? And that goes from how you treat your employees, where you put your money. How does that work on your jurisdictions? There's no specific guidelines for that, but basically they take the opportunity to put everything in it, so they show there's kind of a ranking of sustainability. How does it work in your jurisdictions?
Okay, in our countries, based on the voluntary principles that I mentioned, we have we will have the focus the six points. One of them is the survey and management of environmental and social risks arising from the sectoral activities. The other of them, management of the banking industry's internal effects. And third point goes that human rights and employee rights. And the fourth point goes that stakeholder engagement and communication. Fifth, corporate governance. 6, capacity improvement, and the 7, monitoring and reporting. And in Turkey, for instance, if you, I think, if you create these issues that you mentioned, I think our investors have to pay attention, have to obey the 6 principles, and then if it's okay, and then the bank scan these issues.
Worth mentioning. There has been a sort of audit made by Swiss pension funds and insurances. I think it was back in 2017. It was following the initiative of the TCFD. I don't know if you know the TCFD. The TCFD is a task force on climate-related financial disclosures, so to say, which has been set up by the Conseil de stabilité financière, CSF. And there has been a sort of recommendation to auto-test your alignment in a given industry with the goals of the COP21, which are not to increase more than 2 degrees of temperature within a given period of time. And so you need to assess your own investments or the investments you made. And I think there were approximately 70 institutions, big institutions, that participated on an anonymous basis to this survey. And it appeared that their alignment with the COP21 goals was completely failed. They were more in the range of climate heating of 4 to 6 degrees in terms of investment. But that shows that there is a sort of recognition by the institutions themselves that there is a need to do things, and we can also see that with these. I think it's the network for greening the financial system, to which all the central banks participate, or at least the Swiss one participates. I don't know if in the US the SEC comes to these events, but in any event, there is a sort of recognition and acknowledgement that things must change.
Olivier, sorry. Before the break, could I highlight to our audience another point, because before we spoke about the best practice. In this moment, so we don't have many best practice. Before Olivier and also Julie before spoke about the principle for responsible banking, that I think that is the first best practice in this moment. But there is a very recent news in European Union that I think that is very important, and that is the creation of an international platform on sustainable finance. And the date of the creation of this platform is 18 October 2019, so it's very recent, this news, and it's very important in the field of the best practice for sustainable finance, because yes, the action at national level, regional level is very important. It's important, but it's not enough, and it's very important the action at international level. And the platform is important because the action is relevant, but it is relevant the coordination of this action. And one of the objectives of this platform is exchange and disseminate information to promote best practice in sustainable finance. So I think that this instrument, this platform can be very relevant in European Union for sustainable finance. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I would just like to add a final point, and actually there is very interesting things to read on especially we talked about the EU report on green standards, but I would like to mention a report that has also been published by the technical expert group of the EU, which the Luxembourg Green Exchange is part of. It's a report on benchmarks, and actually the idea is to avoid greenwashing. So that's the main risk. Basically, it's the risk of having a company pretending that the requirements for sustainable investment are met. And I think Nabil probably had the experience of a company that oversell or overmarket its ability to follow ESG guidelines. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Last point, sorry, with your point, because before I say that today the European Council adopted two texts. One text concerned the transparency and the other text concerned your topic that is very relevant, because today the European Council adopted a text that regard the creation of a new category of benchmark contributing to sustainable finance.
And the last word to Nabil, the greenwashing.
Yeah, definitely. That's the elephant in the room, so to speak, because obviously people would tend to do anything to get access to capital. So obviously it's not a question of the carrots and the stick, but the only way one can avoid greenwashing is, first of all, clearer standards, clearer guidelines, clearer normalization, so that you call a cat and a dog a dog. That's number one, because not everyone, in French would say connoté, connotation. You can have as many different versions of that. So that is first a good thing, and I think we're achieving that kind of refinement, although there is no specific international law guiding these. But it has to do with how serious is the investor in ensuring, or the asset manager for our case, in ensuring that the corporates do effectively do what they claim to be doing. And it's not rocket science. You got to test it. And the only way to test it is to be granular, to go on the ground, to see exactly how it's happening, to go frequently, and make it happen. As we have in Switzerland, big firm like SGS, for instance, who do verifications, inspection, and monitoring, then why not suddenly you would have some specialized firms doing specifically that, so that the cost of doing it will be less, but at least you would ensure decent adoption and performance of claims. And I think this is the next development. I think we need this to happen, and we need certification to happen, and that would be the real assurance that there is no greenwashing happening. Because, I mean, even listed companies, you may look at their ESG policies and impact policies, fantastic, but at the end of the day, is it really happening? Is it really what they're doing, and so forth? So I think that would be the definitive answer.
Thank you for all the panelists. I think we can give them an applause.